Bruce Lee's shocking and mysterious death on July 20, 1973 prompted plenty of discussion on a day when there were major happenings going on in the world. The summer of '73 was a tumultuous time, to put it mildly. Bruce Lee had been experiencing headaches and seizures in the months leading up to his death. At the hospital, he was diagnosed with cerebral edema, or swelling of the brain. He was discharged and kept working, but on July 20th, in the midst of working on the movie Game of Death, he complained of a headache, laid down for a nap, and never woke up. After being found unconscious, he was taken to a hospital and pronounced dead upon arrival. After a funeral in Hong Kong, Lee's body was returned to Seattle for burial. The mystery comes from the exact cause of his death, however. Everyone acknowledges that it was cerebral edema, but the cause of the edema itself is a long-standing point of contention. At the time, doctors decided that it came from some sort of reaction to Equagesic, a painkiller Lee had taken for his headache, but it wasn't the first time Lee had taken the medication. Other people speculated cannabis, which was found in his system, had something to do with it, but doctors refuted that possibility. Even in 2018 and 2022, new theories cropped up, claiming that overexertion and heat stroke or drinking too much water could have been to blame.
Running water never grows stale, so you gotta just keep on flowing.
On the same day that Bruce Lee died, there was quite a bit of drama in the skies. Japan Airlines Flight 404 had taken off from Amsterdam for Tokyo via Anchorage when Schiphol Airport's air traffic controller intercepted a secret code that indicated something was wrong. 5 terrorists, 4 from the Palestinian Liberation Movement and 1 from Japan's extremist Red Army group, had taken control of the plane and diverted its course, taking the 123 passengers and 22 crew members toward the Middle East. The terrorists struggled to find a place to land. They were rejected by both Beirut and Damascus airports, but were eventually allowed to land in Dubai. Then Minister of Defense Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum entered into negotiations with the terrorists, during which Red Army member Osamu Maruoka demanded both refuge in Dubai and the release of Kozo Okamoto, who'd been apprehended for a deadly attack at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv the year before.
There could be no negotiations with terrorists.
The negotiations were unsuccessful, and all the skyjackers got was more fuel for their plane. They took off yet again, this time landing in Benghazi, Libya on July 24th, at which point they released the hostages and bombed the plane, destroying it. If you're looking for infamous presidential scandals, look no further than Richard Nixon and Watergate. It began considerably earlier, with Nixon sending a team to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters in D.C.'s Watergate office complex in 1972. But in July 1973, Nixon himself was dragged into the fray.
I told the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
In 1971, Nixon had secretly installed a taping system in the White House, intending to use it to document policy decisions, yet believing its existence would never become public knowledge. Then the Watergate hearings began, broadcast live to the whole nation. On July 16, 1973, Administrative Assistant Alexander Butterfield testified to the Senate about the secret taping system. Only 2 days later, Nixon ordered the system disconnected, and over the next few months, investigators tried to get their hands on the tapes, only for Nixon to repeatedly refuse. During that time, the suspicion surrounding Nixon only grew as more and more people began to believe that the president himself was involved. This was, in fact, a correct assumption. Nixon was involved with the original break-in as well as the subsequent bribes and cover-up.
Apart from the fact that it was wrong, it was stupid. And generally, I'm called many things, but not often am I called stupid.
From there, trust in the presidency fell apart. Nixon finally released the tapes in April 1974 before resigning the presidency later that year. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, members of the extremist Palestinian organization Black September snuck into the Olympic Village, taking members of the Israeli delegation hostage.
Our worst fears have been realized tonight. They're all gone.
Ultimately, all of the hostages were killed and the surviving terrorists went free. Israel wanted justice for their murdered Olympians and began to plan Operation Wrath of God, a Mossad mission to kill the Black September members responsible for the attack. Over the next year, their revenge was brutally effective, but that changed in July 1973. While in Lillehammer, Norway, Mossad agents received intelligence that led them to believe they'd found one of their targets, Ali Hassan Salama, otherwise known as the Red Prince.
Part of the brief that was given to the leaders of the assassination campaign was that they had to turn the terror on the terrorists.
They pulled off the hit on July 21st, shooting their target in front of his wife before scattering almost immediately. But later news reports proved they'd made a horrible mistake. The man they'd killed was in fact an innocent civilian named Ahmed Boushiki, who just so happened to resemble Salama and by sheer coincidence had been seen talking with a Palestinian courier. 6 of the Israeli agents were apprehended in short order, and 5 went to trial the following year. Mossad officials immediately suspended Operation Wrath of God, although it took decades for them to offer compensation to Boushiki's family, albeit without ever taking responsibility. In the 1950s, a miracle drug called thalidomide entered the market, said to cure the symptoms of pneumonia, colds, and even nausea.
A hypnotic, as the doctors call it, that was the answer to a prayer.
Consequently, plenty of pregnant women suffering from morning sickness began taking the drug, which was distributed by the Distillers Company in the UK and said to have zero ill effects. The safety of the drug was hugely overestimated, however, and babies were born with serious birth defects. The link wasn't found until 1961, at which point the drug was pulled from the market. Some pharmaceutical companies were brought to trial, and in the UK, distillers reached a settlement with victims. But many UK victims didn't think it was enough and began a well-publicized campaign against distillers for further compensation. Following a protracted legal battle, another settlement was reached on July 30, 1973, ending a decade of strenuous negotiations. For the most part, the public viewed the plaintiffs as heroic, but distillers denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the legal proceedings had only delayed financial compensation. True crime is a hot topic these days, but not every story about a serial killer is particularly well known. One of England's serial killers has actually managed to slip from public consciousness, Patrick Mackay. Though, to be entirely fair, his list of crimes is a matter of debate. Mackay had several run-ins with the law when he was still a child, was clinically diagnosed as a psychopath when he was just a teenager, and was institutionalized in 1968. All the indications of future violent behavior were there, but he was released in 1972. For the next few years, he wasn't on law enforcement's radar, but the gruesome 1975 murder of Father Anthony Crean led investigators right to him. Upon being caught, he started confessing to a whole host of other crimes, and ultimately he was convicted of 3 murders: Adele Price and Crean in 1975 and Isabella Griffiths in 1974.
The phrase cold-blooded killer could have been invented for Patrick Mackay.
That wasn't all he admitted to, though. He told investigators about 8 other victims. The first was a young German woman named Heidi Milnilk, who was stabbed on a train and thrown to the tracks, where she was found on July 8, 1973. Weeks later, on July 20th, a woman named Mary Hines was found violently beaten to death. 6 more followed between then and 1975, though Mackay later retracted his confessions, and the cases officially remain unsolved, as he could never be conclusively tied to them. Greece was actually ruled by a monarchy until mid-1973, a little unexpected for the country that's often credited with creating Western democracy, right? Technically, the military staged a coup back in 1967, ousting the king who fled the country. Then, in early June 1973, the military government made a bold announcement. It had officially abolished the monarchy and was prepared to turn Greece into a republic. All it would take was for the Greek people to approve the decision in a referendum that would take place a few weeks later. During that time, however, there was a decent amount of discussion about what should be done. The exiled King Constantine II cast doubt on the intentions of the referendum, pointing to censorship and propaganda that had been perpetrated by the military government, and claiming that asking people to vote for a regime that had seized power was strangely ironic. On the other hand, Constantine had never been hugely popular with the people. Sure, there was little open hostility toward him, but his lukewarm reception made it hard to actually determine his standing with the public. That said, the monarchy was dissolved as a political entity, with the military leadership following suit a year later. If you want to be technical, the space race more or less ended in 1969 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. That didn't mean space exploration stopped, however. There were plenty of space missions launched by both the US and Soviet Union throughout the 1970s, even a few joint ventures as the decade progressed. Mid-1973 was actually a pretty busy time for both countries in the Space Department. On the American end, you had the Skylab missions, essentially the first attempt at a long-term space station, a precursor to the International Space Station in many ways. To get more specific, July 28, 1973 was the launch date of Skylab 3, which sent 3 astronauts to space for a record-setting amount of time, nearly 60 days. The Soviet Union wasn't slacking either. While the US was experimenting with long-term stays in space, the Soviets launched a number of Mars spacecraft. On July 25, 1973, Mars 5 was sent on its long journey through the cosmos. The actual probe wouldn't arrive in Martian orbit until February of the following year, and it malfunctioned after a few days, though it did return some atmospheric data and a few photos of the red planet's southern hemisphere first. The space race and the technology it produced is pretty heavily focused on the US and the Soviet Union. They weren't, however, the only 2 countries in the game, and mid-1973 marked the time when Europe on the whole would officially enter the scene. Technically, Europe had started looking into space exploration slightly earlier, but as the 1970s rolled around, there was a need for new programs that would push the boundaries. European leaders wanted to become a serious presence when it came to space exploration and technology, rather than simply a contributor to foreign projects. The European Space Conference was held in the summer of 1973 to outline the exact trajectory for those goals, and there they settled on 3 related projects by July 31st, one of which was a European Space Agency, known now as the ESA. The plan was that it would be ready to go by April 1, 1974, and build on older organizations while promoting unity among the nations of Europe. And given that it's still around with its 22 member nations all actively taking part in launches and missions to this day, it seems they've done decently well at that. In early July 1973, the American public was benefiting from a robust economy, but many people wondered whether it was just the calm before the storm. Sure, there was a lot of demand for consumer products, enough supply to meet that demand, and plenty of jobs for everyday folk. But there was a growing sense of dread that things would take a turn for the worse.
This is unreal. Isn't this disgusting? Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
For the most part, people expected that there was a recession on the horizon, even if they weren't sure how bad that recession would be. The public eye was on the numbers and on the government itself. After all, Watergate was also well underway, and the American people were less than confident in their leadership. And as it turned out, they were right to be concerned.
Inflation went through the roof. People would come into my congressional office and they'd be crying.
One of the issues was a general shortage of raw materials, including petroleum products, oil, in other words, an industry where the U.S. was heavily dependent on foreign imports. When the OPEC oil embargo hit a few months later, the U.S. was wildly unprepared. Heavy controls were instituted on oil, setting up the infamous long gas lines and odd-even rationing, and the economy tanked, leading to a severe recession that would last for several years.